For the past 8 months, I've been covering this situation down in Naples, around the Campi Flegrei caldera. And honestly, when it first started, I treated it like background noise, just another geological oddity to fill airtime between weather reports and traffic updates. But things have changed, and I can't shake this feeling in my gut anymore. Let me back up a bit. Campi Flegrei, if you don't know, isn't your typical volcano with a nice neat cone you can point to on a map. It's this massive sunken area just west of Naples, stretching under the city, under the bay, under towns where 3 million people live their daily lives. The ground there has always moved, always breathed in this slow rhythm that geologists call bradyseism. Up a few centimeters, down a few centimeters, nothing to lose sleep over. Except this time, the ground hasn't been going down. It's been rising for months now. And in Pozzuoli, right at the heart of the caldera, the land has lifted 90 centimeters since last March. That's almost a full meter, if you can picture that. I went down there 2 weeks ago, took a drive through Pozzuoli with my recording equipment, just to see it for myself. The cracks in the buildings, they're not like little hairline fractures you might ignore in your own apartment. These are gaps you could fit your whole hand into, running up the sides of 4-story houses like lightning frozen in concrete. I watched an old woman standing in her doorway, just staring at the crack bisecting her home right down the middle, and she told me she'd lived there for 47 years. She didn't know where else to go. The schools had been closed for weeks because the structures weren't safe anymore. Water pipes kept bursting underground because the ground was pulling them apart. And yet life continued. Cafes stayed open. People walked their dogs. Tourists still showed up to take pictures at the Solfatara crater. The earthquake started getting impossible to ignore around 6 months back. Not the big dramatic ones you see in movies, but these constant tremors, sometimes 50 or 60 a day, rattling windows, making chandeliers sway, waking people up at night. The seismographs were recording 10,000 separate events in just the last 3 months alone. Sarah Greco, she's this volcanologist I've been talking to. She pulled me aside during one of our interviews and told me something off the record. She said the official statements from the Civil Protection Agency were walking a tightrope between keeping people informed and preventing mass panic. But privately, the scientists were watching patterns they didn't like. The earthquakes were clustering in ways that suggested magma movement at depth, and the gas emissions from the Solfatara were spiking. Sulfur dioxide levels up by 280% from baseline. My sister Elisa lives in Naples with her husband Paolo and their 2 kids, Sofia and little Matteo, who just turned 6 last month. I've been calling her almost every day, trying to convince her to pack up and leave, at least temporarily, just until things calm down. But she keeps saying the same thing everyone down there says, that the authorities have it under control, that they've lived with this volcano their whole lives, that evacuation would mean leaving everything behind, their jobs, their home, their entire world. Her husband Paolo works for the city administration in Pozzuoli, actually dealing with the evacuation planning, and even he tells me the logistics are nightmarish. They can move maybe 150,000 people per day if everything goes perfectly, if the roads don't jam, if people cooperate, if there's enough buses and trains. But you're talking about potentially 3 million people who might need to get out. And that math doesn't work unless you have weeks of warning. I met this guy, Leo Barone, who runs a pizzeria near the waterfront in Pozzuoli. Fourth generation, his great-grandfather opened the place in 1923. He told me he can't just close up shop and walk away because some seismographs are acting nervous. He's got employees depending on him, rent to pay, a life built in that exact spot. When I asked him what he'd do if the alert level went to red, he just laughed and said, "Red has never happened, not in his lifetime, not in his father's lifetime." The official level sat at yellow for months, meaning pay attention but don't panic. And just last week they bumped it to orange, which means heightened concern, increased monitoring, prepare for possible evacuation. Still not red, still not immediate danger. But I've been reading the reports Sarah sends me, the technical papers that don't make it into press releases, and the language in those documents carries a different weight. They talk about caprock integrity, about pressure buildup in the hydrothermal system, about how Campi Flegrei has erupted before with devastating force. The last major one was in 1538, created a whole new mountain called Monte Nuovo in less than a week. Before that, you're looking at 39,000 years ago, an eruption so massive it changed the climate across Europe. These things don't happen on human timescales, which makes them easy to ignore, easy to file away as geological trivia rather than present danger. Walking around the Solfatara crater 2 weeks ago felt like stepping onto another planet. The ground was hot enough that you couldn't keep your hand on it for more than a few seconds. Fumaroles were hissing out steam and gases, and the whole area smelled like rotten eggs from the sulfur. The monitoring station there recorded water temperatures in the hydrothermal system reaching near boiling, hovering around 95 degrees Celsius. Sarah explained that this wasn't normal background activity anymore. Something was driving heat and pressure upward, and the system was responding in ways that made her professionally uncomfortable, though she couldn't say that publicly without causing the exact panic everyone was trying to avoid. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and you develop instincts about stories, about when something shifts from routine coverage to something bigger. 3 nights ago, Sarah called me at home, not during business hours, not for an interview. Her voice sounded different, tighter, and she told me the seismic patterns had changed in the last 72 hours. The earthquakes were migrating, forming a pathway that suggested magma was finding routes through the rock, probing for weaknesses. She wouldn't speculate on timelines. Scientists hate doing that because they're usually wrong. But she said, if I had family in the area, maybe now would be a good time to have serious conversations with them. So I called Elisa again, and this time I didn't try to be calm or rational about it. I told her what Sarah told me, told her that the people who actually study this for a living were getting worried behind closed doors. She got quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that's been echoing in my head ever since. She said that leaving felt like admitting the world was ending, like surrendering to fear, and she had 2 small children who needed to see their mother being strong and stable, not running away from shadows. I understood what she meant, but I also wanted to scream that sometimes running away from shadows is exactly the right choice. The business community in Naples has been pushing back hard against any talk of evacuation. Tourism dropped 40% already, just from the orange alert. Hotels are hemorrhaging money, restaurants are empty, and the economic pain is immediate and visible. There's this whole political dimension where local officials are caught between scientific warnings and economic survival, between protecting lives and protecting livelihoods. Paolo, my brother-in-law, told me about heated meetings where business owners accused the government of crying wolf. of destroying Naples over data and projections that might mean nothing. Last night I signed off my broadcast with a joke, told listeners that I'd probably be back tomorrow talking about the same thing, that we'd all look back and laugh about the time we got worked up over a restless volcano. But sitting here now in the pre-dawn quiet of the studio, watching the wire reports come in about another seismic swarm overnight, I don't feel like laughing. But between you and me, I'm starting to wonder if we're all just waiting for permission to be afraid. This is Marco Rossi, and I'm broadcasting from the Emergency Operations Center in Rome because everything changed 6 hours ago, and I need you to understand what's happening right now. At 4:47 this morning, my phone started screaming with emergency alerts, multiple notifications coming through simultaneously, and the message was simple but terrifying. Major phreatic explosion at Campi Flegrei. Immediate evacuation ordered for Pozzuoli and surrounding areas. I was out of bed and dressed before my brain fully processed what I was reading, throwing on yesterday's clothes, grabbing my keys, driving through empty Rome streets toward the broadcast center while trying to call Elisa. The phone just rang and rang, then went to a busy signal, then wouldn't connect at all. By the time I got to the studio, the first reports were coming through from civil protection, and they weren't using careful diplomatic language anymore. Multiple steam-driven explosions had torn open fissures near the Solfatara crater around 4:30 in the morning, violent enough to wake people 15 kilometers away. The initial blast sent a column of ash and steam 4 kilometers into the sky, visible as this dark gray pillar against the pre-dawn darkness. Webcams from Naples were showing the plume spreading, and even in those grainy early images, you could see it wasn't stopping, wasn't settling, just kept pushing upward and outward like something alive. I went on air at 5:20, reading the evacuation orders as calmly as I could manage, but my hands were shaking enough that I had to put the paper down. The official estimate was that they needed to move at least 500,000 people immediately, the ones in the highest risk zones, with potential for that number to climb much higher depending on how this developed. But even as I was reading those numbers, I was thinking about the math Paolo had explained to me, about how long it takes to actually move that many human beings with their families and their pets, and whatever belongings they can grab in a panic. The first eyewitness account came from a truck driver named Enzo Ferri, who was making a delivery run through Pozzuoli when the explosion started. He called in on his cell phone, and his voice had this quality I've never heard before, like he was trying to describe something his brain couldn't quite accept as real. He said he was driving past the Solfatara area when the road just buckled in front of him, this massive crack opening up with steam blasting out under pressure, and the sound was like a jet engine screaming. He abandoned his truck and ran, said the ground was shaking so hard he could barely stay on his feet, and when he looked back, the whole area around the crater was obscured by this dense white cloud that smelled like chemicals and burnt rock. By 6 in the morning, the highways out of Naples were completely jammed. Traffic cameras showed parking lots stretching for kilometers, people abandoning their cars when they realized sitting in gridlock wasn't going to save them, just taking what they could carry and walking. The trains were overwhelmed within the first hour, platforms packed with people shoving to get on carriages that were already full beyond capacity. I was getting reports of fights breaking out, of people climbing through windows, of parents lifting their children over the heads of strangers, just trying to get them onto anything that was moving away from the caldera. I finally got through to Elisa at 6:35, and the relief of hearing her voice lasted about 3 seconds before the reality of her situation hit me. She and Paolo had the kids in the car. They'd been trying to evacuate since 5, but they were stuck on the highway heading north, barely moving. She said they'd covered maybe 8 kilometers in an hour and a half, and I could hear Sophia crying in the background, asking why they couldn't just go home. Elisa's voice was steady, but I know my sister. I know what her fear sounds like, even when she's trying to hide it. She told me they had maybe a quarter tank of gas left, and the last 3 stations they passed were either out of fuel or had lines stretching back onto the highway. Around 7, Sarah Greco called into the studio, and I put her on air because people needed to hear from someone who understood what was actually happening underground. She explained that the phreatic explosions were caused by groundwater flashing to steam when it hit superheated rock, basically the Earth's pressure cooker blowing its lid. But what worried her more was what this meant about the deeper system. The fissures that had opened weren't random. They were aligning in a pattern that suggested magma was rising through the crust, finding pathways, and the explosions were just the surface expression of something much larger happening below. She tried to stay professional, tried to talk in probabilities rather than certainties, but when I asked her directly if this could escalate to a full magma eruption, there was this pause that told me everything. She said the monitoring data from the last 2 hours showed seismic signals they'd never recorded before at Campi Flegrei. And if the pattern continued, if the magma breached what they call the caprock layer, then yes, we could be looking at an explosive eruption within hours. I had to take a break after that call, just stepped away from the microphone and stood in the hallway trying to breathe properly. One of my colleagues asked if I was okay, and I couldn't even answer because I kept seeing Elisa in my head, stuck in traffic 8 kilometers from ground zero, and there was absolutely nothing I could do except talk into a microphone and hope someone somewhere was listening who could help. By 8 in the morning, the ash plume from the phreatic blasts had spread enough that Naples was experiencing ashfall, this fine gray powder drifting down like snow, except it smelled like sulfur and stuck to everything. People were being advised to stay indoors, to cover their mouths if they had to go outside, and I was reading these instructions while knowing my sister was sitting in an open highway with 2 small children breathing that air. The hospitals in Naples were reporting dozens of people coming in with respiratory distress, mostly elderly or people with existing lung conditions, and the emergency rooms were starting to fill up, even though the real crisis hadn't even started yet. Then at 8:53, every seismograph in the region went completely insane. I was watching the live feeds from the monitoring stations, and the lines just spiked off the charts, sustaining at levels that made the earlier earthquakes look like background noise. Sarah called me back, no pretense of calm anymore, and she said the words I'll never forget. The magma has reached the surface. This is now a magmatic eruption. And based on the seismic signature they were seeing, this wasn't going to be small. I tried calling Elisa again, got through for maybe 10 seconds before the connection died. All I heard was her saying my name and then static. I called back 18 times in the next 5 minutes and couldn't get through. The cellular networks were either overloaded or the towers were going down, I don't know which, and it didn't matter because the result was the same. I was in Rome, completely powerless, watching this unfold on screens and listening to reports coming in from people who were there. At 9:23 in the morning, the main eruption began. The satellite feeds showed it first, this massive column of ash and gas blasting upward from the western edge of Pozzuoli. And within minutes it had reached heights that made the earlier steam plumes look like nothing. The column was punching through the atmosphere, 15 kilometers up, 20, 25, still climbing. And the color of it was different, darker, filled with pulverized rock and volcanic bombs being thrown into the sky with force I can't even comprehend. We had a reporter, Anna Costa, and she'd been sending us updates every 20 minutes through the morning. Her last message came through at 9:28, and it was just audio from her phone, not even a proper call, more like a voice memo that uploaded before everything cut out. She said the sky had turned black in seconds, pitch dark like someone had shut off the sun, and there was this sound building, getting louder, and the recording cut off. I sat there staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, waiting for her to call back and say she'd made it to a shelter or gotten out somehow, but there was nothing, just silence where her voice had been moments before. The satellite imagery was updating every few minutes and showing the eruption column continuing to grow, spreading out at the top into this umbrella shape that was starting to drift east on the high altitude winds. The Civil Protection Agency issued a pyroclastic flow warning for everything within 20 kilometers of the eruption center, which meant western Naples, meant the highways where thousands of people were still trapped trying to evacuate, meant the area where my sister had been when we last spoke. By 10 in the morning, we'd lost all direct communication with anyone in the immediate impact zone. The cell towers were gone, the landlines were dead, and the only information coming out was from satellite and from people on the outer edges who'd managed to escape. Every report was worse than the last. The pyroclastic flows had swept through Pozzuoli in minutes. These superheated clouds of gas and rock fragments moving at speeds nothing could outrun. The temperature in those flows reaches 600 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ignite everything in their path. And they don't care about roads or buildings or the people inside trying to shelter. I kept broadcasting because that's all I knew how to do. Kept reading updates and trying to maintain some thread of professional distance while my entire world was collapsing into that column of ash rising over Naples. Somewhere in the chaos and the static and the contradictory reports, my sister had stopped existing in present tense and slipped into past tense. But I couldn't let myself think about that yet, because if I did, I'd never be able to speak another word into this microphone. So I just kept talking, kept telling people what was happening, kept hoping that someone out there was listening and making better choices than we did, getting out sooner, running faster, surviving what we couldn't. I'm still here, still broadcasting, and it's been 18 hours since the main eruption began. I don't know why I'm telling you that, maybe just to prove to myself that time is still moving forward, even though it feels like the world stopped at 9:23 this morning. The eruption column is still visible from Rome, 230 kilometers away. This massive pillar of ash punching into the stratosphere, and every time I look at it through the studio windows, I have to remind myself that's real, that's actually happening, that under that cloud, my sister and her family are gone. The scientists are calling it a VI7 eruption now, Volcanic Explosivity Index 7, which which puts it in the same category as Tambora in 1815, the eruption that caused the year without summer. Sarah Greco tried to explain the scale to me earlier, said the column has reached 35 kilometers into the atmosphere, well into the stratosphere where the ash will spread globally over the coming weeks. The amount of material being ejected is measured in cubic kilometers. Numbers so large they stop meaning anything. But she kept trying to make me understand because understanding is what keeps her sane right now. She lost colleagues at the monitoring station near Pozzuoli, people she'd worked with for years, and I could hear in her voice that same thing I'm feeling, this need to keep talking about the technical details, because the human details will break us completely. We have no communication with anyone in the primary impact zone. Everything within 25 kilometers of the eruption center is just gone from our networks, a blank space where millions of people used to live. The last satellite imagery before the ash obscured everything showed pyroclastic flows spreading across the Campi Flegrei plain like spilled liquid, following the topography, filling valleys, and moving with speeds the human mind can't process as dangerous because they look almost fluid, almost gentle from above, until you remember they're superheated avalanches of gas and rock fragments that incinerate everything they touch. The only survivor accounts we're getting are from people who were on the absolute outer edges, and each one is worse than the last. A man named Diego Serra called in around noon, said he'd been trying to evacuate on his motorcycle, weaving through the gridlocked traffic on the highway, and he watched the pyroclastic flow coming across the landscape behind him like a wall of darkness. He said it wasn't like you see in movies. There was no dramatic firestorm, just this fast-moving cloud that swallowed the cars behind him, and the people who'd gotten out and were running on foot just disappeared into it. He kept his throttle wide open and barely made it past the flow's edge, said when he finally stopped and looked back, there was nothing but gray haze where the highway had been minutes before. Rome started experiencing heavy ashfall around 11 this morning, and by early afternoon we had 8 centimeters accumulated in the streets. That might not sound like much, but ash isn't like snow. It doesn't melt away, it just sits there getting heavier when it gets wet, and the weight of it is already causing problems. I watched from the studio as the maintenance crews tried to clear the main roads, but for every section they cleared, 2 more were getting covered. The air quality warnings have everyone indoors, hospitals are filling up with respiratory cases, and the government has ordered a complete shutdown of the city. No traffic, no businesses, everyone stays inside with windows sealed and air filtration running if you have it. The death toll estimates keep climbing, and nobody really knows anything concrete yet. The official number this afternoon was 500,000 confirmed dead, but that's just the people we know were in hospitals or shelters that collapsed or were overtaken. The real number includes everyone who was in Pozzuoli, everyone who was in western Naples, everyone who was on those highways trying to evacuate, and we won't know that count for weeks or maybe months. 2 million missing is the current estimate, and missing in this context means buried under meters of pyroclastic deposits or ash or collapsed buildings, means never going to be recovered, means families that stopped existing in the span of minutes. I got a report around 2 this afternoon that I still don't know what to do with. Someone claiming to be broadcasting from a basement shelter in Naples. The signal was so degraded and full of static I could barely make out the words, but they said there were 12 people in this reinforced basement, that they'd sealed themselves in when the eruption started, and they were running out of air. The person speaking said the building above them had collapsed. They could hear it coming down during the initial blast, and now they were trapped under rubble with no way to signal rescue teams, even if rescue teams could reach them. I tried to keep them on the line, tried to get a location, but the signal died and I haven't heard from them again. That call haunts me more than anything else today, because somewhere under the ash there might be people still alive, waiting, and we can't get to them. The government evacuated the Central Rome Emergency Broadcast Center at 6 this evening. The ashfall had reached 12 centimeters. The weight was threatening the roof structure, and they made the decision to move all essential personnel to backup locations. I'm broadcasting now from a mobile unit they set up in a parking garage, surrounded by equipment hastily moved from the main facility, and it feels like we're playing at being professional while everything falls apart around us. The Prime Minister gave an address around 7, standing in front of cameras with ash visibly falling behind her, and she announced that Italy was requesting immediate NATO assistance, declaring this a national catastrophe beyond our capacity to handle alone. The EU Emergency Summit is happening tonight, and there's talk of activating mutual aid protocols across Europe. But what's any of that going to do for the people already gone? The secondary effects are starting to show up faster than anyone predicted. Ashfall across Europe is ranging from 2 to 5 centimeters. Flights are grounded from Rome to London, and the economic impact is already catastrophic. A climate scientist named Mia Gallo called into the program earlier and walked through the projections, trying to stay clinical about it. But the numbers she was sharing painted this picture of global disruption that feels surreal to discuss while we're sitting in the middle of it. She said the ash in the stratosphere is going to cause measurable temperature drops worldwide, potentially 1 to 2 degrees Celsius over the next year. And that might not sound like much, but it's enough to devastate crop yields across the Mediterranean and North Africa. Grain prices have already doubled on futures markets, and we're looking at potential famine conditions in regions that were already food insecure. I keep cycling between different emotional states, anger and grief, and this weird detached numbness where I can talk about millions dead like I'm reading a weather report. Earlier I broke down completely, just stopped mid-sentence during a broadcast and couldn't continue. Sat there crying while my producer tried to decide if he should cut to music or let the dead air continue. I came back after a few minutes and apologized to the listeners, said something about my sister being in Naples, and immediately regretted it because personalizing the tragedy felt self-indulgent when everyone listening has their own losses, their own people they can't reach. The infrastructure damage in Rome is accelerating. We're getting reports of building collapses under the ash weight, of the Tiber flooding because the ash runoff has clogged drainage systems, of the power grid failing in sections as transformers short out from the ash contamination. The military has been deployed to maintain order, and there's scattered looting in some districts. People breaking into stores for food and supplies because nobody knows when normal commerce will resume. It feels like watching civilization unravel in slow motion, each hour bringing new failures of systems we took for granted yesterday. Around 10 this evening, Carlo Bianchi, a seismologist monitoring the caldera, called in with an update that somehow made everything worse. The eruption is continuing, the seismic activity hasn't decreased, and based on historical precedents from other super eruptions, this could continue for days or even weeks. The caldera itself is unstable, parts of it collapsing inward, and there's potential for additional explosive phases as different magma chambers interact. He said this as carefully as he could, trying not to cause additional panic, but the implication was clear. What's happened so far might just be the beginning. I found myself thinking about Elisa during one of the quiet moments between updates, remembering this conversation we had maybe 2 months ago when I was visiting Naples. We were sitting on her balcony after dinner, the kids were in bed, and she was talking about how strange it felt living above a volcano, knowing intellectually that the ground could open up at any moment, but emotionally treating it as impossible because the alternative was unbearable. She said humans aren't built to live with that kind of existential dread constantly, so we just file it away and go about our lives. And maybe that's a flaw in how we're wired, but it's also the only way to function. I told her she should take the threat more seriously, and she laughed and asked what seriously would look like. Packing up and abandoning the only home her children had ever known, based on probabilities and projections. I've received messages from listeners around the world throughout the day. People from the US and Canada and Australia sending support, sharing their own experiences with disasters, telling me to keep broadcasting because hearing a human voice helps them process what they're seeing on their news feeds. One message that stuck with me was from someone in California who survived a wildfire that destroyed their town, and they said the hardest part wasn't the immediate disaster, but the weeks after, when the adrenaline fades and you're left with just the absence of everything that used to be there. They told me to take care of myself, to let myself grieve, and I appreciated that, but I don't think I can afford to grieve yet, because grief requires stopping, and I can't stop while this is still happening. The ash is still falling outside, lighter now but constant, and the sky has this strange quality where it never gets fully dark or fully light, just exists in this perpetual gray twilight. Tomorrow I'll be back on air, reading more updates, talking to more experts, trying to help people understand what's happening and what comes next. But tonight, in this parking garage surrounded by equipment and exhausted colleagues, I'm just a man who lost his sister and her family to a mountain that decided to wake up. And I have to find a way to live with that while the ash keeps falling and the world keeps ending in slow motion all around us. This is Marco Rossi broadcasting from Florence, and it's been 7 days since Campi Flegrei tore itself apart. They moved our operations here 3 days ago when Rome became unmanageable, when the ash accumulation reached critical levels and the city had to be partially evacuated. The drive from Rome to Florence normally takes 3 hours, but it took us 9. Crawling through abandoned vehicles and ash drifts that in some places reached 2 meters deep. The landscape looked like something from another planet. Everything coated in this uniform gray, trees bent and broken under the weight, buildings with collapsed roofs, and this eerie silence because nothing was moving. No birds, no animals, just the occasional sound of structures giving way under loads they were never designed to bear. The official death toll is now 800,000 confirmed, with 2.3 million listed as missing presumed dead. Those numbers keep growing as rescue teams reach areas that were cut off in the initial chaos, and every update brings new horror. They found an entire train that had been evacuated from Naples, stopped on the tracks about 30 kilometers from Pozzuoli, buried under 3 meters of ash. 400 people on board, suffocated when the ash flow overtook them before they could get far enough away. The rescue workers who found it said the bodies were still in their seats, some holding children, some holding hands, just frozen in these final moments, waiting for safety that never came. I spoke with a survivor yesterday named Luca Marino, who walked out of the outer Naples suburbs on foot. Took him 4 days to cover 50 kilometers because the roads were impassable, and he had to navigate around collapsed buildings and ash drifts and areas where pyroclastic deposits were still hot enough to melt the soles of his shoes. He described the city as a tomb, streets filled with vehicles that ran out of gas or got stuck, or whose drivers just abandoned them when they realized escape wasn't happening fast enough. He said the quiet was the worst part. This massive urban area that used to pulse with millions of lives, just completely silent, except for the occasional groan of buildings settling or collapsing under the ash weight. The thing that broke him, the thing that made his voice crack when he was telling me this, was passing through a residential neighborhood where someone had written messages on the walls in what looked like ash mixed with water, desperate notes to family members saying where they were going, which route they were taking, asking loved ones to follow. Luca said he photographed every message he found, felt like someone needed to document these final communications, but he doesn't know what to do with the photos now, because most of those people are certainly dead, and the messages are just ghosts calling out to other ghosts. The rescue operations are barely functioning because the areas closest to the eruption center are still completely inaccessible. A woman named Carla Russo, she coordinates one of the rescue teams, explained to me that the pyroclastic flow zones are maintaining temperatures over 300 degrees Celsius even a week later. The deposits are meters deep and unstable, and the toxic gas emissions make it impossible to work there even with protective equipment. They're trying to reach people who might be trapped in sealed basements or shelters, but the reality is that most of those people, if they survived the initial flows, have run out of air or water by now. The few rescues they've managed have been from the outer edges, people trapped in collapsed buildings in areas that didn't get the full force of the flows, and even those operations are incredibly dangerous. I learned 5 days ago that Elisa's neighborhood is completely buried, the entire area covered under 15 meters of pyroclastic deposits. There's no recovery operation planned, no timeline for when they might excavate, because there are hundreds of neighborhoods in the same condition and not enough resources to address any of them. My sister and Paolo and little Sofia and Matteo are entombed under that gray mass, and they'll stay there indefinitely, maybe forever. I've had to accept that there won't be funerals, won't be bodies to bury, won't be any of the rituals we use to process death and find closure. They just stopped existing, and the only proof they ever lived is the memories I carry and the photos on my phone that I can't bring myself to look at yet. The ashfall across Europe has created cascading problems nobody anticipated. Paris has 3 centimeters, London 2, Berlin 5, and all of these cities are experiencing infrastructure failures from the weight and the contamination. Air travel is still grounded across most of the continent, and the economic impact is accelerating into something that looks like it might rival the global financial crisis. The stock markets are suspended, the EU emergency fund has been activated, and there's serious discussion about whether the European economy can survive this shock, or if we're looking at systemic collapse. A climate scientist I interviewed named Mia Gallo walked me through the agricultural projections, and they're catastrophic. The ash in the stratosphere is already causing measurable temperature drops, and the models suggest we're facing significant crop failures across the Mediterranean for at least the next 2 growing seasons. North Africa, which imports most of its grain, is looking at potential famine within 6 months. Food prices globally have quadrupled, and governments are starting to implement rationing and export controls, which just makes the problem worse. She said this very carefully, trying not to cause panic, but the subtext was clear. We're entering a period of global food insecurity that could kill more people than the eruption itself. The refugee crisis is overwhelming every system designed to handle it. 8 million people displaced across Italy, most of them with nothing but what they could carry, and the temporary shelter capacity was exceeded in the first 48 hours. A coordinator named Nora Esposito is running one of the major camps outside Milan, and when I visited yesterday to do interviews, the scale of human misery was just incomprehensible. 12,000 people in a space designed for 3,000, families sleeping in tents that aren't winterized, food supplies running critically low, medical care basically non-existent beyond emergency triage. She told me they're doing everything they can, but the resources aren't there. The government aid is slow, and international assistance is trickling in, but nowhere near what's needed. I met a woman at that camp who'd lost her husband and 2 of her 3 children in the evacuation chaos, only made it out with her youngest daughter, and she was just sitting on a cot staring at nothing. I tried to interview her, ask her what she needed, what would help, and she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. What she needed was her family back, her home back, her life back. And I was asking about blankets and food rations like those things mattered. I've done a lot of interviews this week where I've realized how completely inadequate words are for this situation. How journalism is this absurd performance of trying to quantify the unquantifiable and explain the inexplicable. The social unrest is getting worse. Looting in Rome and Naples' periphery, military deployed to protect supply depots, rumors of government officials evacuating their families while leaving regular citizens to fend for themselves. I don't know which rumors are true and which are panic-driven fiction, but the breakdown of trust in institutions is very real. People feel abandoned, feel like they were lied to about the risks, and that anger is starting to find expression in ways that worry me. There were riots in Bologna 2 days ago when a food distribution center ran out of supplies. 3 people died in the crush and violence that followed. And it feels like we're watching the social contract dissolve in real time. Carlo Bianchi, the seismologist, gave me an update yesterday that somehow I'd been hoping not to hear. The eruption is continuing, diminished from the initial explosion, but still active, and the caldera remains deeply unstable. There's potential for more explosive phases over the coming months, possibility of the eruption continuing intermittently for years. He said Campi Flegrei has entered an eruptive period that might not end in our lifetimes, that the entire region will need to be permanently evacuated, and that we're looking at a fundamental reshaping of the Italian peninsula. The exclusion zone is being expanded to 50 kilometers from the caldera center, which means even more evacuations, even more people displaced, even more homes and businesses and communities just erased. I'm struggling with survivor's guilt in ways I didn't expect. Why am I alive when Elisa isn't? Why did I get to be in Rome while she was trapped on that highway? Why do I get to keep broadcasting while millions of voices are silenced? I know these questions don't have answers. I know guilt is just the mind's attempt to find control in chaos, but knowing that doesn't make it stop. A listener sent me a message saying I'm performing an important service by continuing to document this, by giving people information and bearing witness. But most days it feels like I'm just talking into the void and pretending it matters. The nights are the worst. During the day I can stay busy with broadcasts and interviews and logistics. But at night, in whatever temporary housing they've put me in, I just lie there thinking about that last phone call with Elisa, those 10 seconds before the connection died, and I replay it obsessively, trying to hear something I missed, some final message, but there was nothing, just her saying my name and then silence. I keep thinking about Sophia and Matteo, about how they were too young to understand what was happening, about whether they were scared in those final moments, or if it happened too fast for fear. The international community is starting to mobilize more effectively now that the initial shock has worn off. NATO ships in the Mediterranean evacuating refugees, the US sending aid packages, China offering reconstruction assistance, and there's talk of a Marshall Plan-style recovery program for Italy. But all of that is future tense. All of that is about rebuilding and recovery. And right now we're still in the crisis, still in the dying, still counting bodies and watching the ash fall, and trying to figure out how to feed 8 million displaced people when the food supply chains are collapsing. Yesterday, someone asked me if I thought Italy would survive this, and I didn't know how to answer. The country will continue to exist in some form. Governments will reconstitute, buildings will eventually be cleared or abandoned. Life will find a way forward because that's what life does. But the Italy we knew a week ago is gone, buried under ash and pyroclastic deposits along with everyone who died. We're already becoming something else, something scarred and diminished. And I don't know yet what shape that will take, or if there's any path back to normal, or if normal is just another thing the volcano consumed. I'm broadcasting from Turin now, 4 weeks since the eruption began. And I need to tell you what the world looks like when the ash stops falling quite as heavily, but never really stops. The sky hasn't been blue in a month. Every day exists in this perpetual gray twilight. The sun a dim circle behind layers of stratospheric ash, and the temperature has dropped enough that we're wearing winter coats in what should be late spring. This is the new normal, at least for now, at least until the atmosphere clears itself over months or years. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that normal itself has been redefined by a mountain's decision to explode. The official death toll has been revised to 1.3 million confirmed, 2.8 million presumed dead. And those numbers have stopped shocking me because the human brain can't actually process loss at that scale. It just becomes statistics, becomes abstract, and I hate that I've become numb to it, but numbness is apparently how we survive things that would otherwise break us completely. I've been talking to survivors who are building new lives from nothing, and their resilience keeps me functioning when everything else feels hopeless. There's a woman named Sophia Leone who lost her entire family, husband and 3 children, but she's now running an orphan care program in Bologna because there are thousands of children who lost their parents and someone needs to help them. She told me that grief is a luxury she can't afford right now, that staying busy keeps the worst thoughts at bay. And I understood exactly what she meant because I'm doing the same thing, just broadcasting instead of caregiving. The exclusion zone around Campi Flegrei has been expanded to 50 kilometers and is now permanent. The Italian government has declared the entire area off limits indefinitely, possibly forever, and the implications of that are staggering. Naples as a city no longer exists in any functional sense. Parts of the outer districts might eventually be reclaimed, but the historic center, the port, the neighborhoods where millions of people built their lives, all of that is gone. I spoke with an engineer named Vito Costa who's working on ash removal systems, and he explained that clearing Naples would require moving billions of tons of material, would take decades even with unlimited resources. And the pyroclastic deposits are so deep in some areas that excavation might never be feasible. I drove to the exclusion zone boundary last week, needed to see it for myself, needed to confront the physical reality of what happened, rather than just reporting on it from a distance. The checkpoint is at 50 kilometers out, military personnel in protective gear checking credentials, and beyond that there's just this gray wasteland stretching to the horizon. You can't see the caldera from there, can't see Naples, just this endless expanse of ash-covered terrain with the occasional shape that might be a building or a vehicle or something that used to be recognizable. The air smells like sulfur and burnt rock, and they make you sign waivers acknowledging the toxic gas risks and the residual heat dangers before they'll even let you near the boundary. Standing there looking at that desolation, I tried to picture the landscape that used to exist underneath all that gray, the roads I'd driven, the neighborhoods I'd visited, the balcony where Elisa and I had that conversation about living above a volcano. It's all still there technically, just buried, frozen in time under meters of deposits, a city-sized tomb that we're never going to open. The rescue worker who escorted me to the boundary said they occasionally still find people alive in sealed shelters near the outer edges, but it's been 3 weeks and those discoveries are increasingly rare. Most of the people they find now have been dead for weeks, suffocated or dehydrated or poisoned by gas, and the recovery operations are shifting from rescue to body retrieval, though even that is limited to the accessible areas. The global impact is accelerating in ways that make the initial disaster feel like just the beginning. Crop failures are starting across southern Europe. The temperature drop and reduced sunlight from stratospheric ash are affecting photosynthesis, and the agricultural projections I heard a week ago are already proving optimistic. Grain prices have increased by 400% globally, and the UN is warning about famine conditions in North Africa within months. I interviewed a humanitarian coordinator named Rosa Vitelli, who's trying to organize food distribution for 8 million Italian refugees, and she said the international aid is nowhere near sufficient, that donor fatigue is setting in as the crisis extends past the initial emergency phase, and that we're facing a long-term displacement situation with no clear resolution. The refugee camps have become permanent settlements. I visited the Milan camp again yesterday, and they've stopped calling it temporary, have started building more durable structures and establishing governance systems in schools for the children. The woman I tried to interview 3 weeks ago, the one who lost most of her family, I saw her again, and she was teaching a group of kids basic math in a tent classroom. She didn't recognize me, or maybe she did and chose not to acknowledge it, but watching her write numbers on a portable whiteboard while children sat cross-legged on the ground, I felt this strange mixture of hope and despair. Life continues, people adapt, humans are incredibly resilient, and also this is an absolute tragedy, and no amount of resilience makes it acceptable. I've been receiving letters and messages from listeners around the world. Hundreds of them, people sharing their own experiences with disasters and loss and survival. Someone from New Orleans wrote about Hurricane Katrina, about how the city never fully recovered, how displacement scattered communities that never reformed. Someone from Japan wrote about Fukushima, about exclusion zones and permanent evacuations and learning to live with landscapes you can never return to. Someone from Australia sent a message saying they play my broadcasts while they sleep because hearing a human voice processing trauma helps them process their own. And I found that both touching and deeply sad, that my grief has become a form of companionship for strangers halfway across the world. The Italian government is trying to function from scattered temporary capitals, the bureaucracy distributed across cities that weren't designed to handle it. There's serious discussion about permanently relocating the capital from Rome, about restructuring the entire administrative system around the new geographic reality. The economic cost is estimated in trillions of euros, and there's genuine question about whether Italy can remain a functioning state, or if this breaks the country in ways that lead to fragmentation. The EU has activated massive aid packages, but there's also tension about who pays for reconstruction and what form that reconstruction takes. I finally visited the memorial site they established in Florence for the victims. It's this temporary installation in a public square, thousands of candles and flowers and photographs, and people coming to leave tributes for the lost. I brought a photo of Elisa and her family, one from last Christmas, where they're all smiling in front of a tree, and I placed it among the others and just stood there for a while, not really thinking anything, just existing in proximity to all this collective grief. A priest named Tony Guerra was leading a memorial service, speaking to families who had no bodies to bury, trying to provide some form of ritual closure when closure is impossible. He talked about memory and continuity, about how the dead live on in the people who remember them. And I appreciated the sentiment even though it felt inadequate to the scale of loss. The volcano itself continues its slow burning. The eruption has diminished from the catastrophic initial explosion, but Campi Flegrei remains active, still venting ash and gas, still seismically unstable, and the volcanologists say it could continue this way for years or decades. A scientist named Silvia Fiori explained that the caldera has entered a new eruptive phase, that the magma system underneath is fundamentally changed, and that the region will likely never be safe for human habitation again in our lifetimes. We've permanently lost a piece of Italy to geological forces that operate on timescales we can barely comprehend. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to bear witness, about why I'm still doing these broadcasts when most days it feels like shouting into a void. Someone told me that documentation matters, that future generations will want to understand what happened and how people responded. And maybe that's true, but it feels abstract compared to the immediate reality of trying to help people survive today. But I keep showing up at the microphone, keep conducting interviews, keep reading updates, because what else am I going to do? Silence feels like surrender, feels like letting the mountain win completely, and I'm not ready for that yet. The recovery efforts are slowly organizing into something systematic. International engineering teams working on ash removal, temporary housing being upgraded to permanent structures, economic aid starting to flow more consistently. It's nowhere near enough, and the timeline for anything resembling normalcy stretches into decades. But it's something. It's movement in a direction that isn't just collapse and despair. I interviewed a group of young people yesterday who are training to be reconstruction workers, learning skills to help rebuild whatever version of Italy emerges from this, and their energy felt almost alien after weeks of talking to traumatized survivors and exhausted aid workers. Last night I finally looked through the photos on my phone, the ones of Elisa and her family that I've been avoiding. There's one of her laughing at something Paolo said, one of Sofia and Matteo playing in a park, one of all four of them at the beach last summer. They look so alive in those images, so present and real, and it's hard to reconcile those faces with the fact that they're gone, buried under 15 meters of volcanic deposits in a city that no longer exists. I don't know what to do with these photos, whether to print them or share them, or just keep them locked in a device as this private archive of a life that ended too soon.